It always begins with a single, deeply unsettling photograph. I was staring at a digitized cabinet card, dated around the year 1880. In the frame, two ordinary men in tailored suits are standing side by side. Right next to them, a third figure towers into the frame. He is not standing on a hidden wooden platform. There is no forced perspective at play here. There is no clever camera trick to deceive the eye. His anatomical proportions are absolutely flawless, yet he is simply, unreasonably, and terrifyingly massive. The faded ink caption beneath the photograph reads, "A marvel of nature, or the finest deception in showmanship." I sat there in the silence of my room, staring at those exact words. Why are those the only two options presented to the public? Why, in the late 19th century, was the collective mindset of society already tightly pre-programmed to view these extraordinary beings as either a biological freak show or a deliberate, calculated hoax? It is almost as if someone desperately needed the audience to choose the hoax explanation. Think about it. If you wanted to hide a monumental anomaly, something that completely shatters the accepted timeline of human history, you would not burn the physical evidence. Burning evidence leaves ashes. It creates martyrs. It creates dangerous, lingering questions. Instead, you would execute the most brilliant psychological manipulation ever conceived. You would hide it right in plain sight. You would dress the truth in a cheap, ridiculous costume, put it under a brightly colored striped tent, and sell tickets to the public for 10 cents. You would throw it in the circus and let the audience laugh at the very thing that proves their history is a lie. Let us step back into the shadows of the late 19th century. Specifically, the incredibly crucial window of time spanning between the year 1850 and the year 1910. We are told by mainstream historians that this was simply the golden age of the traveling circus. It was supposedly the absolute height of the freak show phenomenon. The famous showman Phineas Taylor Barnum capitalized on the cultural mindset that there is a sucker born every minute. That specific phrase has been so deeply and aggressively embedded into our collective cultural consciousness that it has become the perfect, unquestioned lens through which the modern public views that entire era. We are taught that it was a period defined entirely by theatrical deception, cheap tricks, and the willing suspension of disbelief. That framing is incredibly useful for those in power, because here is exactly what that framing accomplishes. It creates a totalizing psychological barrier. Anything, absolutely anything, placed inside a circus tent, under the flickering and dim gas lamps, was automatically registered by the human brain as a performance. It became a staged anomaly, and right at this exact moment in history, something absolutely incredible and profoundly unsettling happened. A massive, unprecedented wave of remarkably large human beings suddenly and simultaneously appeared in the public record. We are talking about individuals like Colonel Ralph Goshen, who was heavily marketed as the Arabian Giant, Captain Martin Van Buren Bates, the Kentucky Giant, Chong Yu Sing, the famous Chinese Giant. These specific names, and dozens of others just like them, were plastered on brightly colored promotional posters across the entire North American continent. But here is the critical detail that should send a genuine chill down your spine. This phenomenon was not in any way confined to the United States. While Barnum was displaying these towering physical anomalies in New York, identical traveling exhibitions with the exact same interpretive framing were popping up everywhere. They were operating in France, in the German states, in the Russian Empire, in the Ottoman capital, and even in the distant dusty cities of South America. All of them were operating during the exact same historical time frame. All of them were using the exact same psychological playbook. Across vastly different cultures, completely different languages, and deeply divided political borders, the public messaging was flawlessly, terrifyingly uniform. Every single unusually large person was strictly packaged and presented as either a tragic medical aberration, a pituitary freak of nature, or a cunningly padded fraud. The audience was told to choose one of those two options: buy a 10-cent ticket, stare for a few minutes, and move along. I want you to really think about the sheer, undeniable logistical impossibility of this situation. In the 1860s and the 1870s, there were no transatlantic telephone cables. There was no global internet. There was absolutely no instant communication infrastructure available to coordinate a massive, synchronized cultural narrative across multiple continents. Yet, somehow, the exact same psychological framing, the exact same method of dismissal, appeared globally at the exact same time. Therefore, we are forced by the physical evidence to ask ourselves a terrifying question. Was this truly just an organic, spontaneous cultural coincidence? Or was it a highly coordinated global assimilation campaign? It looks exactly like a silent, paperless operation designed from the shadows. An operation meant to strip a genuine, physical race of humans of their true historical identity and lock them safely inside the untouchable realm of cheap, disposable entertainment. Let us move forward and examine the glaring paradox of the historical data. The 19th century was fundamentally the golden age of modern bureaucracy. It was an era defined by meticulously kept ledgers, by newly standardized birth certificates, exhaustive census records, and deep, multi-generational parish registries. By all logical accounts, and by the very standards of that specific era, we should know exactly who the parents, the grandparents, and the great-grandparents of these towering individuals were. We should possess their full, unbroken family trees. But when you attempt to trace their lineages backward in time, the historical trail goes terrifyingly cold. The truth is incredibly chilling when you look closely at the archives. Most of these individuals were entirely stripped of their real human identities, and they were aggressively slapped with cheap commercial labels. They were reduced to being called the Kentucky Giant, or the Arabian Giant, or the Chinese Giant. These are merely labels of convenience, completely lacking any actual biographical substance. Their personal histories are heavily fractured, and when you try to dig deeper to find their true geographical origins, the official records simply blur. And then, without any logical explanation, they vanish completely. They literally evaporate from the paper trail. It is almost exactly as if they were orphaned by history itself. Now, let us look at the official medical explanation that was used to justify their existence. The newly established medical literature of the 19th century aggressively branded all of them as unfortunate pituitary patients. They were clinically diagnosed as victims of acromegaly, or gigantism. The official, scientific narrative established a strict, unbreakable biological ceiling, confidently claiming that these individuals rarely, if ever, exceeded 8 feet in height. But here is the exact moment where the official story collapses under its own massive weight. During those exact same decades, local newspapers across the entire United States, stretching from the rural Midwest all the way to the highly populated eastern seaboard, were constantly publishing countless detailed reports of massive skeletal remains being excavated from the earth. We are talking about highly specific documented reports of human bones measuring 9 feet, 10 feet, and even 12 feet in length. So, what did the scientific establishment do when confronted with this physical evidence? They immediately and systematically dismissed every single one of these archaeological reports as sensationalist newspaper fiction. They looked the public in the eye and told them not to believe their own local, trusted journals. Therefore, we are forced to confront a massive, glaring contradiction in the historical record. The authorities explicitly told the public to blindly trust the measurements on the circus posters, but to completely and entirely dismiss the measurements from the local archaeological digs. Why were the institutions of the era so incredibly selective about what the public was allowed to believe? Why would they meticulously erase an entire bloodline from the bureaucratic records, only to quickly replace it with a highly convenient medical diagnosis? But then, a massive, highly calculated shift occurred in the global narrative. As we crossed the threshold into the early 1900s, the brightly lit circus tent was simply no longer considered a safe or viable place to store these massive physical anomalies. The world was rapidly modernizing. Information was spreading faster than ever before. Everyday people were beginning to ask far too many uncomfortable questions about the true origins of human history. So, the establishment, the invisible hands guiding our consensus reality, initiated a great, silent transfer of power. The towering figures, the so-called freaks of nature, who had been paraded around for decades, were quietly and systematically pulled away from the unforgiving public stages. They did not simply die out naturally, nor did they vanish into thin air. They were transferred, They were physically and legally moved from the open, accessible gaze of the general public directly into the cold, sterile, and highly restricted gaze of the professional academic expert. The newly formed, highly credentialed medical institutions, the modern research hospitals, and the heavily guarded national museums began to aggressively extend their bureaucratic reach. Almost overnight, these towering individuals went from being a highly visible public spectacle to becoming heavily classified, closely guarded medical case studies. They were literally locked away. Their physical bodies and their remaining historical records were shoved inside confidential patient files. They were secured behind the thick locked doors of university archives and basement storage rooms, where the average curious citizen could never, ever hope to reach them. Think about the sheer dark brilliance of this strategy. If you tell a man he is looking at a monster, he might try to fight it. If you tell him he is looking at a miracle, he might try to worship it. But if you confidently tell him he is simply looking at a tragic biological malfunction, he will feel a brief moment of pity, and then he will look away. And looking away was exactly what the establishment desperately needed the public to do. This was, without a doubt, a flawlessly executed tactical maneuver. The medical establishment weaponized complex diagnostic theories, using them as an impenetrable brick wall against public scrutiny. They began to throw around heavy, intimidating terms. Words like severe pituitary dysfunction, rare endocrine disorders, and pathological gigantism were aggressively deployed to completely shut down any lingering public curiosity. They decisively slapped a clinical, scientific label on the anomaly and declared the case permanently closed. Absolutely no further public discussion was permitted. By physically moving these massive bodies out of the highly visible entertainment economy and burying them deep within the closed loop of the scientific economy, they effectively silenced the entire narrative. The general public was no longer allowed to wonder if they were looking at the last, surviving descendants of a forgotten, colossal race. They were strictly instructed to accept, on blind, unquestioning authority, that they were simply looking at a very sick patient. And just like that, the living, breathing evidence of a completely different human history was locked in a vault, redefined forever by men in white coats. Let us deeply examine the truly heartbreaking and profoundly revealing historical case of Edouard Beaupré. He was famously known across the continent as the Willow Bunch Giant. He tragically died in the year 1904. His immediate family, who were simply ordinary, grieving people from a small town, desperately pleaded with the authorities for the safe return of his physical body. They just wanted to give him a proper, dignified, and traditional burial, but they were coldly and categorically denied. Instead of returning a son to his mother, a highly prestigious university stepped in and permanently confiscated his remains. They locked his massive body away from the world, officially classifying it as a mere scientific specimen. And they deliberately kept it there, hidden in the dark, for nearly an entire century, 100 years. I want you to stop whatever you are doing right now and really truly think about the sheer, terrifying magnitude of that institutional decision. Why on earth would a modern, supposedly ethical institution need to ruthlessly hold on to a dead man's body for an entire century? What exactly were those scientists studying behind closed doors that they could not easily find in a normal, average human corpse? Were they secretly examining his extraordinary bone density? Were they quietly sequencing his anomalous DNA? Or were they simply making absolutely 100% sure that the physical, undeniable, concrete proof of a completely different human bloodline never, ever saw the light of day again? This is exactly the kind of highly designed, systemic silence I am talking about. Think about the countless giant skeletons that were allegedly rushed into the deep, highly restricted underground vaults of the Smithsonian Institution during that exact same era. Think about the thousands of anomalous medical reports that were permanently sealed from public view, stamped as classified or confidential. This deafening silence is not simply the accidental result of poor 19th century record keeping. It is a carefully constructed, deliberately engineered void. It is a massive structural shape designed specifically by the victors of history, intended to perfectly hide the very physical evidence that would instantly shatter their fabricated, mainstream timeline. They did not just coldly steal these giant people's lives to use them for cheap carnival entertainment. They went a step further. They literally stole their deaths. They stole their graves. And they did it to desperately protect the fragile consensus reality that you and I are forced to live in today. So, what is the ultimate terrifying truth hiding at the bottom of this historical rabbit hole? The entire 19th century circus industry was never, ever a harmless, joyful celebration of the strange and the unusual. It was, in reality, a perfectly executed, incredibly brilliant psychological heist. It was a meticulously managed, deeply controlled public disclosure of the impossible. The global elite took the very real, physical, undeniable evidence of a lost, giant human race, and they intentionally dressed it up in cheap, humiliating clown clothes. They did this specifically so that you and your ancestors would point and laugh and completely refuse to believe the evidence of your own two eyes. If these towering, magnificent figures were simply sick, pathetic individuals suffering from random glandular mutations, why on earth did the most powerful scientific institutions of that era work so frantically and so secretly to control their historical narratives and even their physical corpses? What exactly are they so deeply terrified of us finding out about our own hidden human past? I want you to ask yourself right now, in the quiet of your own mind, is the modern world we live in actually built on a solid foundation of true history? Or are we all just wandering blindly, day after day, through a carefully constructed, brilliantly designed matrix of lies? Let me know exactly what you think down in the comments section below. If this video made you question the fabricated reality you were obediently taught in school, hit that like button right now and subscribe to Tin Can Kwa Bon for more deeply declassified truths. Until next time, keep your eyes wide open and never, ever stop questioning the official narrative, because the real truth is never handed to you on a silver platter. It is buried in the dark, waiting for you to dig it up.